Thank you so much. You're welcome to ARN, which is African Researchers Network event. This month event is so special because we have some special scholars discussing a very pertinent topic, which cuts across scholarship in African studies, literature, gender studies, as well as issues around African Western feminism. But I will just do a little housekeeping. This ARN website, the organization's goal is to be able to bring forth African scholars and the others in the diaspora, the African diasporas, and to enter into conversations on topics that are very important and which their scholarly work has dwelt upon. And our goal and objective can be read from there. We have the advisory board, which we have Dr. Evwierhoma as a president and the other executives. And then, as you can see, that we have the directors who play various roles to ensure that we have this event coming up every month, and to ensure that we have publications and get in touch with all other archiving works that we are doing. And then we also have associates who are working day and night to get speakers, to also help with newsletters, and also to help in other logistics. And every event that we hold, like this particular webinar, what we do at the end is to come up with a newsletter to be able to, so that people can reference some of the issues or discussions that are raised, so that the points raised by each callers will not be in vain. And this, you can see that for the past events. And then we archive the videos of almost all the events we have, especially this webinars that we have been having for more than a year now. And today we are having the August webinar, and the moderator for today is Evwierhoma Dabale, who is the director for public relations. And we also have our consultant, Dr. Shabazz, as the host for today's event. So I hand over the virtual microphone to both of them. So thanks for coming, and thanks for responding to our invitation.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Pardon me. Okay. I think you can hear me better now.
Yeah.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you for being here. And right now, I'm going to have Dr. Shabazz to do the introduction of our speaker. Dr. Shabazz, are you there?
I think he has to unmute himself.
Dr. Shabazz?
In the Division of Languages and Literacies and Literatures in the School of Education at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. She attained her PhD in African Literature from the University of Witwatersrand in 2011, and has since lectured in several South African universities. Her research specializes in the retheorization of African feminisms from contemporary African scholarship and the exploration of representations of gendered violence and women's empowerment in African women's literature. She has published widely and in journals in English, in Africa, the Academic English Academy Review, and the South African Theater Journal, and the Journal of Literary Studies. She's also published in international journals such as the Research in African Literatures and many more. She currently holds a National Research Foundation rating of category Y1, and her studies includes reviews. She's written reviews for articles, books, publishers. In addition, she is a chief editor of Mbizo, International Journal of African Literacy and Comparative Studies, and published by UNICEF Press. She's won several awards, including the most resourceful staff member award from the University of Limpopo, the Golden Key Membership Award from the Golden Key Society, and the DAD Scholarship for Young Academics and Scientists. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nkealah to our panel.
Thank you so much, Brother Shabazz. So good to see you again. At any points you can't hear me, please just stop me, let me know, because my internet can play the devil's advocate sometimes. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to this forum. And I'm particularly honored to be sharing this platform with Professor Mabel, whom I've known for the past 12 years. It's indeed a privilege to have this event with her. All right, so the topic given was quite broad for me to play around with. So we're looking at Western and African feminisms in search of common ground. So I have a question mark at the end, in search of common ground. And speak around that. The polarization of Western and African feminisms is a dominant trait of African feminist scholarship. This is mainly because African feminisms were theorized as a backlash in feminisms, with the aim of offering alternative conceptualizations of women and women's experiences that the West seemed to have no knowledge of or faint ignorance about. For a long time, it seemed that these two feminisms would never have common ground, as African feminists brewed their theories in indigenous pots, steaming with issues around culture and women's place therein, colonialism, Western imperialism, nationalism, and racism, while Western feminists, particularly white middle-class feminists in Europe and North America, stewed their feminisms using the same ingredients, usually marriage, sex, and the body. Moreover, our African sisters, the list is very long, Ogunyemi, Nawa El Sidawi, Ogudipe Leslie, Desiree Lewis, Catherine Acholonu, Gloria Chukwukere, Juliana Fambeni, Obimana Imeka, Philomena Akachi Ezegbo. They wrote about feminism in ways that were very specific to their context, not claiming to propose universal understandings of gender. Whereas our sisters on the other side of the ocean, such as Simone de Beauvoir, Sheila Jeffries, Julia Christopher, Betty Friedan, Adrienne Rich, Hélène Cizou, and Luz Guerre, dished out feminisms that tended to put all women under one umbrella, homogenizing their experiences as if cultural differences did not matter. In the face of opposing approaches to feminism, was it possible that Western and African feminisms would ever find a meeting point? Johnson Odin insisted 20 years ago that although there are common themes in Western and Third World feminism, such as the fight against gender oppression and the quest for the recognition of women's rights, they too are produced in very different contexts, and therefore tensions will always characterize their relationship. By contrast, African feminist Akachi Ezegbo has been more optimistic in perceiving of commonality in Western and African feminisms. And in theorizing,
Prof, pardon me for interrupting. We didn't see your slide.
Yes, I totally forgot. See, should have shared it that time. All right, so we need to make it bigger somewhere here. Right, hold on. Okay, so there we go. Can you see now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so all right, so here I am. All right, so Akachi Ezegbo has been more optimistic in perceiving grains of commonality in Western and African feminisms, and in theorizing a snail-sense feminism, she states that snail-sense feminism shares the trait of individualism with Western feminism. In the last 2 decades of African women's development of feminism, it has become more and more apparent that pockets of resonances continue to emerge between African feminisms and Western feminisms. Yet, it may not be prudent for me to call it common ground, if ground is taken to represent foundations, roots, origins, and key concepts. It looks more like common top to me, as these feminisms continue to be anchored in largely opposite cultural contexts, but somehow speak to each other above their differences. So in this presentation, I use the example of South African feminism and French feminism to illustrate my suggestion that increasingly we are witnessing common tops between African and Western feminisms. In metaphoric terms, we are looking at 2 trees rooted in independently but intertwined at the top, creating a bouquet of foliage in pristine glory. It was in 1990 when renowned South African feminist scholar Cecily Lockett published an article entitled Feminisms and Writing in English in South Africa, in which she took a critical look at Western feminisms and argued that these feminisms could not be applied in the South African context because of their fixation on sexual textual politics, while South African women were battling with daily bread and butter issues owing to apartheid's institutionalization of racism. For Lockett, there is a necessary continuum between a person's identification of self as a feminist and their professional practice as a critic or teacher of literature. And therefore, in the South African context, and this is Lockett, she says, where any critical paradigm must necessarily focus on issues of both race and gender, being a feminist means giving emphasis to gender politics within the framework of a struggle for a more equitable society. Now, Lockett begins her criticism of Western feminisms by showing the limitations of French feminism for South Africa, arguing that these feminisms were trapped in Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalytic theories that assumed all women's bodies to operate in the same manner, that is, desiring the pleasures suppressed by a phallocratic order. According to Lockett, such explorations of desire and expressions of female libidos as conceptualized in the theory of écriture féminine by Sizou and Grigare were not practical in a South African context, especially in the 1990s, where women's everyday lives were marked by physical deprivation and racial oppression. The jouissance or libidinal pleasure that these feminists were harping about were irrelevant in the face of harsh and painful realities of suffering and oppression experienced by women in South Africa. And that's what Lockett says. I may add that Irigare's deep philosophizing on women's autoeroticism, in which woman touches herself all the more for her genitals are formed of two lips in continuous contact, was such an abstract idea that it is hard to imagine women writers of that time trading the quest for gender and racial equality in their stories for a pursuit of writing that celebrates autoeroticism. Seriously, how valuable was such a pursuit to their struggle? Irigare's advocating of a textual disruption of the masculine parameters by which women's sexuality has always been conceptualized was not even close to being a priority for women in apartheid South Africa. Lockett therefore argues it is their inability or their unwillingness to come to terms with the material conditions of women's lives and their oppression and their failure to offer solutions beyond the ideal or utopian that marks theories such as Sizou and Grigare as Western, privileged, and, of course, bourgeois. To sum up Lockett's argument, French feminism, locked in the fancy language of linguistics, philosophy, and psychoanalysis, had no place in apartheid South Africa, where the fight on the ground was a quest for freedom and from oppressive racial laws. Now, that fight has been over, in the interesting part. That fight has been over, at least officially, for the last 27 years. And it is now important to revisit the question of whether South African women's cultural productions are still opposed to ideas of jouissance, or whether in the current post-apartheid climate, there is evidence that feminists are now finding ways of writing the body to convey ideas around women's sexual pleasure, auto or otherwise. In The Laugh of the Medusa, Sizou encourages women to take on writing that inscribes femininity, that talks explicitly about their bodies, about their self, about women, their loves and their hates, their passions and pains, their desires and fears, because historically, writing has not allowed women to construct themselves through their own eyes. Their lives have typically been represented through the male gaze. So in Sizou's conceptualization of écriture féminine, writing the self is a feminist act in which women overturn patriarchal domination of writing by putting themselves at the center of their own textual creations. And those are her opening words on the screen. Similarly, in this sex, which is not one, Grigare calls on women to invent their own language about their bodies, to write in ways that dismantle masculinist representations of women's bodies, which is the quotation right there. I want to suggest here that African feminist literature now houses a body of work that utilizes this kind of feminine language to convey ideas of women's sexuality. South Africa presents a good case. Although writing apartheid continues to be a central focus of South African women's writing, feminists are also now engaging in writing the female body, inscribing its desires in text, painting its physical attributes on canvas, expressing its deepest thoughts in words. Now, when Lockett made her claim about the irrelevance of écriture féminine in the South African feminist space, it was at a time when gender and race were the two dominant categories of oppression by which women's lives were measured. In the post-apartheid era, especially from the year 2000 to the present, sexuality has been added into the mix as women's sexuality is constantly under surveillance by the heterosexual patriarchy. Women's quest for sexual equality is now as urgent as the quest for gender and racial equality was under apartheid. In the face of inordinate violence, gender violence, and gross violations of women's bodies through rape, domestic violence, and cyber shaming, a new kind of feminine writing has emerged, very similar to écriture féminine. But it is not writing per se, as it encompasses painting, photography, and spoken word poetry. With regard to poetry, Gilead Schutt has done beautiful work in looking at the ways in which South African women's written and spoken word poetry echoes the laugh of the Medusa in creating a feminine language divorced from the repressive sexual machinery of masculine discourse. Analyzing poems by Leboma Shinle, Maisha Jenkins, Ndoni Kanile, and Helen Moffat, which are unmistakably feminist, in speaking Jouissance, she argues that the current marked explosion of sexual and embodied poetry becomes a form of rebellion, even a revolution, a subversive feminine voice which aims for women to speak on their own behalf and resist being spoken for by the representatives of the patriarchal order. End of that quotation. Like Schutt, I read a form of écriture féminine in contemporary South African women's artistic productions. And since these productions go beyond the written word, it is necessary to call this kind of feminine discourse by another term. Perhaps we can call it parler féminin, talking feminism through the body. It is all about expressing in art forms, writing, painting, film, photography, poetry, performance, drama, and music. And I'm glad Professor Mabel is here. She's a drama specialist. Using all these forms to express what women feel sexually, right? And to show how through these forms, they can express their sexuality. Now, this concept is very similar to Evwierhoma's concept of parler femme, which means speaking as woman, to disrupt or alter the syntax of discursive logic in order to express the plurality and mutuality of feminine difference and mime the relations of self-affection. Parler femme and parler féminin are only distinguished in that parler féminin involves the whole gamut of feminine self-expression, not just the overtly sexual. Schutt provides an example of how rural women in South Africa express libidinous joy as they move their bodies in song and dance during protest rallies. Even where parler féminin is expressed as sexual, it is not strictly lesbian. Amira Patel's poem, Insecure at Ease, is a beautifully composed poem about female sexuality in conflict with reason. In an interview with Schutt about her writing, Patel states, "For me, writing your body is taking ownership of your body. You remove it from the other voice and describe it according to a real female voice." End of quotation. So in parler féminin, body politics is not conflated with sexual politics. And sexual politics does not always mean lesbian sexual politics. All women express express their sexuality in different ways and writing about their most intimate desires, even those that are culturally acceptable. It's a risk in a world dominated by patriarchal thinking and therefore an act of subverting language. South African feminist scholarship is increasingly bringing to our attention cultural productions about women's sexuality and the complexities around its presence in public spaces. I have already highlighted the work of Shoot, which examines explorations of women's sexuality in South African women's poetry. Now, Naomi Nkealah has written about Zanele Muholi, the cultural artist and photographer whose work celebrates lesbian love and entered a Freedom of Expression Award in 2013. In her potent and arresting poetry, photography, Muholi presents images of Black lesbians in intimate postures and spaces, emphasizing woman-to-woman love as real, beautiful, and normal. Analyzing 3 of Muholi's exhibition series, Period, Beloved, and Close to My Heart, Nkealah argues that in her images of semi-naked Black lesbians in various intimate poses, Muholi is able to visualize intimacy's varied meanings: privacy, beauty, pleasure, connection, and exclusivity. Thus, lesbian love as captured in these images expands our horizons to see Black lesbians as normal as white lesbians, and challenges our discomfort at beholding sites traditionally considered abhorrent. Because for once, female sexuality is not being served up as dessert for heterosexual men. We look at these images and we see joyful lesbians unconcerned by external dominant readings of their lives. And we begin to embrace possibilities of a South Africa devoid of homophobia. Nkealah knows that at her most powerfully evocative and courageous, as these photographs show, Zanele Muholi ushers in a new language to articulate Black lesbian sexuality creatively and politically at the same time. This new language is not couched in the heavy Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis that Locke accuses French feminists of. Language that is highly meaningful sometimes, but it is nonetheless a feminine language. It is powerfully feminine, understandable to its audience because it speaks directly from the heart and mind of the photographer. Yet one must recognize that beyond the philosophy and theory, Sizou is primarily contesting for women's creation of their own feminine writing space, because she states that writing is precisely the very possibility of change, the space that can serve as a springboard for subversive thought, the precursory movement of a transformation of social and cultural structures. In the case of Muholi, we are looking at visual art that has the power to change what we think about Black lesbians and how we construct their identities. From poetry to photography to prose fiction, what I call my 3 Ps, we find salient examples of South African women's work that embodies the concept of parler feminine in its varied richness of scripting female sexuality. Jessica Marais' work, while centering its feminist discourse on lesbian sexualities, also draws attention to the sexuality of older women and the pleasures they experience with their bodies despite the wear and tear of age. In her analysis of Rosella Matt's short story, No Rosa, No District 6, in Matt's collection, Rosa's District 6, Marais looks at the small pleasures enjoyed by 2 older women in this story as they undress each other, as they undress in each other's presence, and Mrs. Hood lays her head with long gray hair gently on Auntie Flower's shoulders. It is an intimate gesture that speaks of a sexuality crying to be released from social confinements of passivity, inactivity, and taboo. Marais notes, I quote, while representing these bodies as very different from the idealized images of youthful femininity, Matt shows them to be sources of great sensual pleasure in the women's sexual encounter. Thus, one can argue that Matt writes the feminine from an intersectional perspective that looks at sexuality, gender, race, and age in a symbiotic relationship as women negotiate bodily pleasures. I do agree with Marie that despite the tendency of dominant social forces to pathologize the sexuality of older women and of women of color, the lesbian characters in these texts defy social expectations to form a caring and nurturing relationship in an environment that is characterized by extreme racial and gender oppression. In this text, which is not one, Evwierhoma poses the question, how can I tell you that there is no possible evil in your sexual pleasure, you who are stranger to goods? Now, Matt seems to be telling South Africa, there is no possible evil in older women enjoying sexual pleasure. They are entitled to even the minutest acts of bodily expression. Writing the feminine in this way adds to the multiplicity of female sexual expression that characterizes l'écriture féminine, parler femme, and parler féminin. Can we then say that parler féminin expressed in South African women's work shares common ground with Sizou and Evwierhoma's écriture féminine and parler femme? Again, I'm being cautious here, and I will argue that it's more of common top than common ground, because at the foundational level, l'écriture féminine advocates the fall of phallocracy, what I call hashtag the phallus must fall, to make way for the dominance of the female libido. Whereas parler femme, as illustrated in the works discussed here, advocates the dismantling of a misogynistic and homophobic order that violates the rights of South African women, lesbians included, rights enshrined within the Constitution. L'écriture féminine speaks female desire as a form of resistance to the phallocentric structures of Western cultures, whereas parler féminin inscribes lesbian desire as a protest to social injustice manifested through the rape and murder of LGBTQ women in South Africa. Moreover, as Lockett pointed out, French feminism is handicapped by the refusal of activism by its followers in favor of theorizing, which remains a comfort zone. By contrast, South African feminists, such as the ones whose works have been discussed here, are activists whose presence in public media spaces continue to make a profound impact on the struggle for gender, sexual, racial, and class equality in South Africa. So by way of conclusion, I reiterate that there's little commonality between the French feminism of Sizou and Evwierhoma and South African feminism at the level of conception, what calls conceptual ground. That's what it really is, conceptual ground. But there is commonality at the level of target. After all, this feminism seeks to do is to foreground the importance of women writing the feminine from their own perspectives, right? Writing from pre-established masculinist perspectives and inscribe self-love. What the feminists want to do is to inscribe self-love, woman-to-woman love, and intimate desires in ways that inspire new ideas about women's agency and subjectivity. Amira Patel, cited earlier, states in her interview with Schutz that she was not consciously influenced by any feminist theories when she composed her poetry, the poem we saw earlier. And she states, for me, my poetry isn't based on theory, but life. Now, so what is my overall point deduced from the case of South African and French feminisms? My point is that as feminisms mature, the political context that produced them change, they also change. Feminisms are not stagnant. They are constantly evolving with time. And in the process of that evolution, they create synergies with other feminisms, not become copycats. That, I think, is the classic of African and Western feminisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for such an insightful paper. To our audience, thank you again for being here. We are also, so now we're going to hear from our next guest speaker at the end of the presentations. Then we're going to have the Q&A. Yes, Brother Austin, you want to say something? Okay, your hand is up, that's why. Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Yay. Thank you. And now, Brother Shabazz, could you read Dr. Maria's bio? Thank you. Go to Shabazz. We can't hear you. I think he's muted. Pardon us. Let me see.
Okay, yeah, I got it now. Yeah.
Okay.
I was muted. I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you, Dr. Nkealah, for those compelling arguments about the role of body politics in South Africa. Our next speaker is Dr. Maria Martin. She's a professor of African history. She holds a PhD in African American and African Studies with a concentration in history and women's studies. She recently did an oral history in Nigeria on women's non-political activism, and she has won 4 Fulbright Awards for her research. She is currently working on a theory of gender activism rooted in Yoruba culture. She is an advocate for bettering gender relations through gender awareness. She served as a grant writer for a nonprofit organization uplifting African American girls, trained Nigerian teachers on how to be gender equality advocates in their classrooms, and she has mentored young African and African American ladies to help them publish, write grants, do research, and pursue a college education. Dr. Maria Martin, the floor is yours.
Doesn't work that way, you know, they're all intertwined. So also we have this principle that their needs and worldviews, Black women's needs and worldviews are distinct from those of Black men and white women. So we definitely have some distinct needs for Black women that are not the same, obviously, and that are not going to be able to be addressed by a politic that speaks to only the needs of Black men or only the needs of white women. And then we have this principle that all oppressions, whether they be racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, all of the isms, you know, whatever the oppression is, they have to be addressed simultaneously. And so for me, you know, this is really kind of talking to and, you know, speaking to intersectionality. So intersectionality is this idea that, you know, is really inherent in Black feminist tradition that, you know, people and, you know, Black women specifically have oppressions that are interlocking. And they call that intersectionality. You know, that was a term that was, you know, used to describe what Black women had already historically been recognizing and operating with, this idea that oppressions are interlocking. But in the 1980s, Kimberly Crenshaw developed that idea of, you know, intersectionality. She named it. So those are some principles, you know, some foundational principles of Black feminism. But just to, you know, as a historian, I have to give a little bit of history. And so just to talk about some historical figures and just give an idea, a further idea of Black feminism here in the US. Some, you know, Black feminism is embodied. It's an embodied practice. And it was made evident by women like Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, and the women of the National Association of Colored Women that was founded in 1896. So for me, as I stated before, it's really a response to being Black and a woman in a racist, sexist society. And so when we go and look at the history of Black women, Harriet Tubman, obviously, a very well-known, you know, anti-slavery and freedom fighter and advocate for the freedom of Black people. She went and freed, she made more than 19 trips back and forth between very dangerous, you know, territory to free many Black men, women, and children from slavery. Ida B. Wells later on, she, you know, her writings expose white hatred and the murders of Black people, the horrors of lynching, you know, in the South. And she also started this Alpha Suffrage Club, which registered Black men and women to vote. And then we have the National Association of Colored Women, which was really a social and political reform group. And their motto is lifting as we climb. So just in these historical figures, we can see that there's a current for Black women and Black feminism. They're, trying to lift as they climb, right? So lifting others up as they also climb up. So they're not only focused on themselves, they don't have a myopic focus on their own, needs, their own culture, their own context. They're actually trying to bring others along. So they're fighting for the community and the health of the whole community. Whereas other types of feminism, especially in the earlier period, were more focused, especially with white feminism, for example, that was obviously more focused on white women and not a community, not other people, so on and so forth. So we see this element early on in Black feminism where they're not only fighting for themselves, but they're fighting for the community as a whole. So they have, a really humanistic element to Black feminism. So when we move from that period, that, very early period of Black feminism being embodied by these early, women freedom fighters, writers, and, women's groups, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we get to the 70s, women's issues are at this point during, this Black liberation movement. We have different groups of Black Panthers, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, all of these different groups that are fighting for civil rights and, Black liberation. So during this moment in the 70s, women's issues are really pushed to the periphery because Black liberation struggles are really seen as Black men's struggle against white men to affirm their manhood. So when you have a conversation like that, you don't really, where are the women, right? You can ask, where are the women? So this kind of thinking that, Black liberation equals Black men's liberation is evidenced by, different people, Frantz Fanon, Stokely Carmichael, Kenneth Clark. Stokely Carmichael said that, every Black person is a potential Black man, meaning that every Black person, or meaning that Black men are really the targets of, racial oppression and white rage and anger, and Black men were really primarily the ones that were in danger, of being harmed by racism. But that's not true. Obviously, Black women suffered just as much, just as, harshly, but I think sometimes people might they might confuse the way that, racism is experienced by, Black men and Black women. We can't put one above the other, but they're both, equally important to address. So, this is kind of the context that's going on, and then we have groups like the Third World Women's Alliance that's really important to, the founding of Black feminism in this era, where Frances Beale spoke, really against racism, sexism, and classism. So again, they're highlighting that interlocking oppression, but groups like the Third World Women's Alliance started to come up because of this element within Black liberation struggles that really, looked at men's issues, looked at racism as an issue of primarily Black men and not really paying attention to the intricacies and ways that Black women are affected. So this Third World Women's Alliance, it had its roots in 1968 with the Black Women's Caucus that was founded by the Black Women's Liberation Committee. So the Black Women's Caucus was a part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was run by students, but it was all, run really led by men. And, obviously women were a part of that group, but they had this Women's Caucus, and the Women's Caucus, kind of realized that their issues were not really being addressed by SNCC, and they wanted, their issues to be addressed, and they wanted a space where they could feel free to talk about and address issues that they face. So they created they kind of left out of SNCC to create the Women's Liberation Committee, which became the Third World Women's Alliance, that then went on to express that there is this interlocking oppression that Black women are definitely facing that's not, being spoken about. And they said, we really need to address these issues. So that's kind of how Black feminism, starts to really come about. And as the movement continues in this moment of the 1970s, Black women started to become, disillusioned with Black liberation movements at a certain point, and saw that they were more patriarchal and dismissive and even abusive to women. So when we think about this, Elaine Brown comes to mind. She was the first woman leader of the Black Panther Party. And not to demonize this party or anything that they've done, but we have to look at the complexity of the existence of men and women in these, parties, in these movements. And so Elaine Brown was one of the first women to lead the Black Panther Party at a point where women were still, poorly treated and even beaten by men, in the Black Panther Party. So I remember, reading about a story, and it was a Black woman who was a teacher in the Black Panthers. So the Black Panthers had freedom schools. They had their own newspaper. They had a free lunch program for children. They had medical clinics for the people in the community. They were doing mighty and great things for Black people, for the uplift of Black people. And women were the ones that were really running all of different, elements. They were the workers that were keeping things together. And so, there was a woman who was heading the Liberation School, and she had a male, Black Panther member that was working with her. And she asked him about, a project that he was supposed to be working on, an assignment that he needed to get done that he didn't have done. And so, she, approached him about it. And it ended up with her being beaten by a group of men, Black Panther men, beaten. And these other notable women in the Black Panther Party also had, issues like this where violence was actually, meted out on them. And then we have examples of Black Panther men like Eldridge Cleaver, who was a rapist. He wrote about this, in his autobiography. He also talked about Black women in very disparaging ways. But he said that he would rape young Black women in, these ghettos and parts of the town and the city, where if they told anybody about it, people wouldn't really believe them because of their position and their status in society. And so he started raping them to practice and perfect his craft, or so to speak, so that when he got to raping white women, he would be more comfortable, confident, and better at it. It's really shocking and sad, but this is what happened. He wanted to rape white women to get back at white men. So this is also a gender issue that we would need to address, that women in the Black Panther Party were experiencing, and that we need to talk about. And so this is kind of the era, that in the context that Black feminism was growing out of. Who's going to address these issues for Black women? Even though Black women are very staunch supporters of Black liberation, are Black liberation leaders really supporters of Black women? And are they addressing the issues of Black women? Is not to say that all of them, were like this or were, oppressive to Black women, but, we definitely needed something that was going to address the issues overall that were not being talked about, that Black women, were experiencing. So, we move on from the 70s with this, element of, okay, Black women need to speak out, about their issues. And in 1997, we have the Million Woman March, 125,000, women, mostly Black, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, came out, and Winnie Mandela actually spoke at that conference. And this is kind of like a transnational outcropping of Black women. And it was an interesting moment between Black women, Black feminism, and African, feminism as well. So I want to just mention, with Black and white feminism, just quickly some differences. So for me, when we talk about Black feminism, you can't not mention white feminism, because the reason why Black feminism, one of the reasons why Black feminism is coming up is because of the experience of Black women with racism and sexism in this society. And so when the women's movement, the women's suffrage movement, or white women's movement began, it was, very exclusionary to Black women. So there's two types of feminism: white feminism, Black feminism. I think there's cultural, historical differences between the two. Obviously, racism, Black women were excluded. And then there's different agendas. White women discuss goals that were not attainable to Black women, such as taking over the spheres of influence of white men. Black women, would not have an avenue to take over the spheres of influence of white men because of racism as well as sexism. There's all these obstacles that they have. So, they didn't even have access to the things that the agendas items that white women had. And then obviously there's cultural, historical differences. And I could take that back to even just antiquity. But for the interest of time, I'll leave it there. And I want to talk about, the silencing of Black women as well. So when we look at, Black feminism, women's issues, as I've stated, were kind of pushed to the periphery because Black liberation struggles were seen as Black man's struggle against white men to affirm their manhood, and all of that, just, as a recap. And, this was kind of evidenced by men, like Frantz Fanon, Stokely Carmichael, and this caused women's groups to come up. So we see all of these kinds of things happening, shaping, Black feminism. But Black feminism, as it grew, obviously it became more diverse. And then we have ideas like womanism by Alice Walker. In 1983, she said that womanism, it highlights all forms of oppression. So it puts all forms of oppression at a level of equal concern. This means that it considers a broader survival and wholeness of the entire community, men and women. It's not a separatist ideology. So some people might say that feminism can be more concentrated on women, gender, sexism, but womanism is more concerned with the whole relationship between men and women and the wholeness of men and women. So it's not really a separatist ideology in that way. And then we have Africana womanism that comes up in 1993, which says that it's intended as an ideology to be applicable to all women of African descent. So it's grounded in African culture and Afrocentrism and focuses on the experiences and struggles and needs and desires of Africana women. So we see here another growth and outcrop of this transnational thought in, Black feminism. So we have womanism that expands to Africana womanism. There are some interesting conversations here and critiques. So with Clenora Hudson Weems, I thought it was really interesting when she did a lecture and she said, in terms of white feminism and Black feminism, some Black feminists want to move from the margin to the center of the feminist, conversation. But she asked the question, who invited you to the center? you know, because feminism in the beginning, you know, obviously Black women have always and African women have always been engaged in feminism. So we don't need to mistake that. But when people think about Western feminism, they think about that white feminist movement, you know, first. And so she made the point that white, you know, Black women came along and, you know, co-opted the term feminism from white women. And then they wanted to change the agenda of white women. And so, you know, it's like, why would, you know, white women center you in a movement that they created to center themselves, you know? So that's one issue, which is really interesting that she brought up as to why there needs to be further, you know, thinking, further development of Black feminist thought, Black feminist theories. And that's why womanism comes up. That's why Africana womanism comes up. And, you know, Black, womanist theology and all of these, you know, different currents of Black feminism are coming up. So there's diversity in Black feminism, but I'll end by saying that Black feminism is, you know, it strives to be inclusive, reflexive, and empowering for not only women across class, sexual orientation, and levels of physical and mental ability, but it's also created or credited with this realization that people are affected by interlocking oppressions like race, sex, class, and this represents a broader spectrum of individuals when we look at interlocking oppressions. So I think that with Black feminism, some of the things that we can look towards in Black feminism are ideological expansion and practical expansion. So considering more Black women's, you know, feminist characteristics, Black women have already started in the past to look at transnational connections. Winnie Mandela, you know, came and spoke at that Million Women's March in the 90s. Even way before that, you know, Black women have been reaching out and making connections with African women. I know that you know, who was it? Adelaide Casely Hayford of Sierra Leone. She came to the US and, you know, studied girls' schools because she wanted to build, you know, a movement to educate girls in Sierra Leone. She got together with Nanny Helen Burroughs, who was a educator among Black women in the US. And that was, you know, Nanny Helen Burroughs, that's, you know, late 1800s, early 1900s, so a long time. Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, you know, the, you know, famous Nigerian women's liberation leader. She also reached out to women like the first wife of Marcus Garvey. Her and Marcus, so Amy Ashwood Garvey came to Nigeria and went to Abeokuta, spent time with Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, and they had, you know, this relationship, and they were talking about, you know, the liberation of African women in this transnational perspective. Funmilayo Ransome Kuti also reached out to women in the Caribbean, Black women, and so we always have had this element of transnational outreach among Black women, but I think that there can be an ideological and a practical expansion of that to create stronger transnational connections and agendas that speak to more global Black issues. I think that Cleonora Hudson Weems tried to do that with Africana womanism, but we, you know, definitely need a little bit more, because sometimes when people in this context are trying to reach out to, you know, African women, African people, they can sometimes do it from a standpoint that essentializes African culture. So we need to be more rooted and grounded in the context and experiences of African women and global, you know, Black women in order to achieve these more healthy, stronger connections that are transnational. So that is my time, and thank you so much for hanging in there and listening to me, and I can't wait, you know, till we get to the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Brother Shabazz, it's your turn for the intro.
Well, that was wonderful, Dr. Mark. We did more than hang in. That was a great overview of the development of feminism in the US. Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Professor Mabel Evwierhoma. She's a renowned scholar activist who holds a PhD from the University of Ibadan. For 20 years now, she has been teaching theater arts at the University of Abuja, Nigeria. She is a teacher and critic of drama and theater from women-centered, gender, and cultural perspectives. Her scholarship has taken her to countries in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and America. And it is evident in publication and outlets such as journals, book chapters, books, and other treatises. Professor Mabel is a staunch believer in the Nigeria public school systems and engages in local and national extension of services in communities as well as for non-governmental aid organizations to uplift the status of women and the girl child. Apart from these, she is a lawyer and a creative writer, mainly in the genres of drama and poetry. Professor Mabel, the floor is yours.
Professor Mabel? Let's see. He's parting us. Professor Mabel.
I thank you for inviting me to present my views concerning feminism, the search for a common ground, whether that is possible or not. I started the presentation by discussing what feminism is, the origin of the term in 1837 as feminisme, that it is a multi-pronged stance. It is multi-pronged, and it is also meant to counter male hegemony in its various forms, whether as patriarchy, whether as sexism, whatever controls women's space is what feminism stands to challenge. It also tries to, attain the rights of women. And Umukoro says it is a philosophical standpoint. But he now checks himself and says it is a variety of philosophical standpoints and ideological objectives. And so the diverse context of the ideology makes it necessary for us to consider it in plurality. And so, be it the politics of domesticity, labor, rights, which all co-join to balance politics and culture, it still maintains that standpoint of trying to fight to end the oppression of women. And so, in its various forms, quite many, almost 100, we see the radical stance that focuses on mainstream and the need to challenge to the roots the factors, the conditions that hemline women. The liberal, which focuses on bourgeois ideologies and the need for equality between men and women. There are different forms, the eco-feminist, the cultural, name it. But when we come to Western feminisms, we see the foundation that was laid for people to start to, consider that requirement for a change in viewpoint. Because Western feminisms may be global, may be sweeping, may be universal, may also, like other brands of feminisms, try to liberate women. But the major disadvantage of the standpoint of the ideology is that it's monolithic and lacks integration of opposing views. And that's according to Marilyn Boxer. It's also exclusionary and does not capture the concerns of African feminism well. Because of the refusal to see that white men could also be oppressed, and its radical posture not being accepted in Africa, because a lot of Africans consider Western feminisms to be imperialist, and that it is mainly white middle class or made up of white female academics. The standpoint of challenge, of fighting what Western feminisms stand for, began in Africa, in the Orient, as well as even in Europe and America. As an ideology, it's explained in waves from the first to the third. Some even consider a fourth wave of feminism. The historical specificity of Western feminism is what also gives it a lot of teeth, because Western feminists have engaged in a lot of knowledge production, often backed by legislation, especially British feminisms. The hegemonization of relations now makes it possible for these documentations, these various texts, creative texts, or even outcome of research, to balance what is racist and what is anti-racist in Western feminisms. Its foundations from the Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft may also, give it that foundation of equality. And then the struggle against sexism would also stand it in good stead where some African feminists are concerned. But then, because Western feminists consider African women to be subjugates of culture and traditional practices mainly, a lot of African feminists, especially from the West African sub-region, and we may zero in on Nigeria, to say that culture is not prison. Culture could in fact liberate many Africans. And so that dichotomy, that aspect of culture, the aspect of politics, the refusal to see that the white man is also a victim of patriarchy sometimes, made that divide, made that chasm to be very wide. Also, if we are to look at some of the issues that we see in African feminisms, we realize that some may fight against culture. Some may want to, insist that culture is the strong point of African feminisms. And so between European feminism, especially the French feminism, which is writing-based and is on the oppression of women, like the Écriture féminine, being phallocentric or dissident, looking at the works of Simone de Beauvoir, Hélène Cixous, Luce Irigaray, and even Gayatri Spivak. And then the shift to North American, brand of feminism that looks at race, gender, space, and power. That's from the perspective of bell hooks, or even womanism, femaleness and blackness, or even color, or women identification in the works of Audre Lorde, or Africana womanism that we just heard about from the last speaker. We come to see that even in Latin America, where for centuries women have been known to, fight against male hegemony, we see that the subversive approach, the stance, that courage to counter centrist or far-right ideas as propounded by Sapota Stenbach and her contributors, its militancy, revisionism, the premium on reproduction and motherhood makes it imperative for us to now use this point of motherhood, which is also found in African feminisms, to counter Western feminism that would want to have nothing to do with men sometimes, that would, want separate spaces of operation between men and women, and the issue of same-sex relationships, maybe women identification, gay approaches, or lesbian, beliefs, okay? And so the premium on reproduction and motherhood was even used against the military. The mothers of the Plaza de la Mayo, or the desperate women who marched every Thursday against the oppressive regime that would abduct children, that would make those children missing or absent from their homes, never to be seen again, also pointed towards the democratic angle of Latino feminism. Its focus on slavery and colonialism, nativism, and race also mattered a great deal. Now, when we come to African feminisms, we note through the body of literature that we've had feminists long before the colonial encounter. Ya Ashantewa, Queen Nziga, Queen Emota, most of who used the privilege of their political status in society to advance the cause of women. Presently, we may see African feminist struggle as a pastiche of different regional tapestries, which focus on patriarchy, sexuality, cultural identity, historical examinations, experiences of activism through the exposure to Western education, and then contextual activism that is most of the time dissident. When we look at context, and we agree with one, old feminist now who said, context is all. From South Africa to Kenya, to Ghana, to Nigeria, to Tunisia, to Algeria, we see the contextual divide that makes it almost impossible to have common grounds. Let's look at the Nigerian trajectories. Before independence, we witnessed the Aba Women's War, known as Ogu Umunwanyi in Igbo language, and then the Egba Uprising that sacked a sitting Alake of Egba land. So between 1929 in Aba and 1946 in Egba land, we could say confidently that the then do not referred to as feminist movement, women's insurgency could have paved or may have paved the way for the drive towards independence, towards constitutionalism in Nigeria. African feminism also has linkages from the Nigerian perspectives with labor engagement. Most of the picketing we've had over decades reflect women being actively involved. Even the recent sorry about that, had a lot of, women involved, spearheading the need to speak out to banish mutism from the women's movement. And then knowledge production.
Prof, we can hear you. You're muted. Prof? Professor Mabel, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you now.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I've unmuted myself.
Yes, we can hear you now, ma'am.
I have unmuted myself.
We can hear you, Prof.
I have unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay, please, for how long was I muted?
Maybe 2 minutes, or maybe.
Okay. Still on the Nigerian. Okay. I said that. Did you hear me when I talked about the Aba Women's Riot?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, Prof.
And the Egba uprising?
Yes, Prof.
Did you hear me when I spoke about that?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we heard you.
Okay. So now talking about knowledge production, we see that the need to produce knowledge and consume it from the local front has become imperative. And so I talked about Amina Mama, Bisi Adeyemi, Amina Salisu, Shamim Pereira, and many other feminists who have engaged in the documentation of processes, liberational processes, processes that help to voice out the concerns of women, and then highlight the need to share power. Refer to Women in Nigeria, refer also to the National Commission for Women that was established in 1989, before we now had the women's policy and then the national gender policy. All these give impetus to the struggle for women to affirm themselves through creativity, through writing, through speaking out, and even using new media of communication to highlight women's concerns and advance them. And so, talking about African feminisms, we've had a lot of gains. We now have a body of thought that is specific, that is particular to the continent, despite different contexts, despite diversities of culture, language, colonial experience, and present experience, if you ask me. And so for me, that meant the extension of the frontiers of feminism. Even though we see it as an alien ideology, because of the involvement of local indices, we have extended the frontier of feminism. We didn't, produce the name, we didn't initiate the name, but Africa has contributed to the feminist movement. And then the recognition of emerging areas like conflict, focusing on the experiences of women in conflict situations, the need for non-violence have also helped. Asking women to shatter the glass ceiling, to be involved politically, and then the massification of women's ideas through mass organizing, visibility for women's issues, audibility that I talked about, debates, counter standpoints, revisions, query, documentation are some of the gains of African feminisms. And so, because we need to see it in the plural rather than singular term, the shades of womenism, Nkealah, provided a taxonomy of feminisms, okay? And so let me skip this slide and look at, and pick one point, which is that we have male apologists in the feminist struggle, and they have helped to advance the concerns of women. And so in North Africa, where we have Nawal El-Sadawi, Niswia, Denderiat, Shuf. I want to focus on Shuf because Shuf, sees the need for same-sex relationships. And Nada Ali, in her treatise, dwelt on some of these indexes. In West Africa, Amataidu, Amina Mama, Benema Dunagu, Omolara Ogundipe Leslie, and for me, the divide would focus on academic activism and legwork activism. the two refer in Africa. And then in East Africa, I singled out the Green Belt movement of Wangirai Maathai, you know, a standpoint on ecofeminism. In South Africa, the women's movement remains resistance-driven, struggles for equality, remains multiracial, addresses patriarchy, the gender pay gap, the struggle to actualize the dividends of democracy and end sexual and gender-based violence. For example, the Black Sash movement, Macheke, Helen Joseph, Winnie Mandela, as outlined by Amber Lenser. Okay, so the impetus that we have given to African feminist thought and feminism would make us lay claim to that slice that we have cut out for ourselves to be authentically African, especially through the mothering factor, the mother essence, the mother earth essence in Evwierhoma Oyewumi, who talks about matripotency and matrocentricity, or Nzegu, who says that morality commences with the mother, or Catherine Acholono and her ideology of motherism and the focus on the earth as mother, or Evwierhoma Nkealah, who talks about walking in our mother's gardens. And because these ideologues have, chosen spheres that are familiar to women, linked to domesticity, and by the time we stretch it, we could also, ascribe some politics and activism to it. The African writer feminists, could be discussed briefly here. And Gladys Laoye says that African feminists seek a separate signifying experience from those of white women. I agree with her 100%. And these women are mostly in academia. Even though we lack solidarity, Pan-Africa, across Africa, in Egypt, the contributions of Nawal El-Sadawi, or in Ghana, Amata Eidu, or Abena Busia, in Kenya, Michere Mugo, or South Africa, like Cheryl Delare, Jane Bennett, or Nigeria, Ogundipe Leslie, Acholonu Ezeibo, Akachi Ezeibo, Okonjo Ogunyemi, Irene Agunloye, name it, will now make us focus on cross-African perspectives. And these perspectives mainly are from Nigeria. I refer to Naomi Nkealah's taxonomy of feminism. And then, interestingly, she talks about misovirism. That's the feminism of Were leaking, okay? Nego-feminism, snail sense feminism, humanism, feminism, and of course, my own coinage, African feminism or metarism. So it's not all, beauty, cohesion, agreement where African feminism is concerned. We have some anti-feminists who could be seen as post-feminists, who oppose women's rights, who see feminism as irrelevant, as un-African, who see the ideology as masculinism, shaded masculinism, which should help men to recover lost ground, and who think they have to counter female ascendancy, support women as homemakers, as specified in the holy books. This reminds me of Rosemary Radford Reuters' concern when she talks about sexism and God talk, giving women that scapegoat tag for causing the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. Other anti-feminists are Zainab Alkali, Charles Nolim, Tohwe Esubiyi, and others. Pro-feminists have been mentioned before now, but I would want to talk about the role of government, okay, that I mentioned before, in having institutional frameworks or legal frameworks to help to advance, African feminisms. And the social chameleons, women who use the political offices of their husbands to advance the cause of women through pet projects. And of course, international institutions like the AU, the UN, the ECOWAS, and other regional bodies, okay? My personal encounter with feminisms in the African context made me to propose African feminism that relates to the Nigerian condition and the African condition in 2002, or Metarism. And so presently, the diverse manifestations of feminisms across dramatic creativity, politics, poetry, socioeconomics in Nigeria provide stimulus for one to be at home with the metaphor of the ladle, the cooking spoon. I have one here. Okay? And to me, when you dip the ladle into the pot, you scoop up something different. Each time you dip it into the pot, you have varied experiences, varied, protein or spices to dish out of the broth. And so the several journeys into the broth by the ladle has a different experience, projects a different experience. And so African feminists showcase diverse standpoints and experiences. Therefore, what are those things that unite or separate the divide between white feminisms and African feminisms? Being biased towards women, motherhood, child rearing, the issue of nature versus nurture, conception, control, reproduction, Western ideas, African ideas, governance systems in Africa versus the ones in the West, the overlapping constructs. We have same concepts, varying shades, different angles, and the aspect of agitational aesthetics, many struggles with global impact. And so to conclude, I say that there can be some common perspectives which may serve as common grounds of relatedness between Western feminisms and African feminisms. The interconnectedness on linkages through global scholarship, has also helped. And when we base relationships across social categories, male, female, young, old, and then harness the various experiences through documentation, we see some meeting points. And so race and space continue to be dividing factors between African and Western feminisms. Therefore, no one should ever pretend to be the other and vice versa, especially white feminisms, because it's not been able to harness the gains, the experiences of Black women or women of color. And of course, the male apologists who are of African descent have not been, properly captured by Western feminists. Knowledge production from cross-African cultural perspectives is essential, and the need for true economic emancipation of women is needed, is appropriate. The approaches should be synergy-driven. When we seek common ground, we should be able to work together and highlight those common grounds. But where diversity rears its head, we shouldn't look at the other standpoint as inferior to the other, because every experience, every woman's experience is authentic. And so the central meeting point is in our humanity. We all eat, we pass out waste, the same blood flows through our veins. Furthermore, the search for common grounds for feminism should not prejudice indigenous counter narratives about it. Because I said somewhere that it is this need for holistic alternatives relevant to African values and mores that has necessitated the suggestion of homegrown alternatives to white feminist stance. So where there are deliberate steps not to seek common grounds, allowances should be made for the metaphor of the ladle that I talked about. So each woman, what she scoops from knowledge or experience is a kind of ladle experience. The need for the documentation of standpoints and processes refer greatly. And so to end this presentation, I ask this pertinent question. Must there be any search for common grounds? Must we have common grounds? Africa must hold her own in the drive for ideological relevance and broaden the scope of engagement. The feminist backlash in Europe and America created the certainty of reactions and counter-response to the different feminist realities that subsist therein. African feminist validation of commonness across variegated feminist discourses requires an authentication from Africa first, from within first, then from outside Africa. Education for and mentorship of young women are also crucial. African feminism or any movement, ideology to advance the cause of women should be on African terms. Any feminist drive should also fight poverty at all levels. I ask again, must there be a search for common grounds as diverse as African women's perspectives are? By the way, who searches and on whose behalf? Who is to conduct the search and on whose behalf should that search be conducted? Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you being here. You took the time to, alongside the other panelists, thank you so much for being here. Because of the interest of time, I'm not going to say much. I'm gonna thank you to our audience. We're going to see if there are questions that anyone has. And just real quick though, I would say that I appreciate the how you gave us a scope of feminism globally, and then you zoomed in to Nigeria and showed specific example of how feminism is working. And then the other part of it is how you introduced us to African scholars. Many of us are overseas, and we cite other scholars, you know, from scholars that are not indigenous to our communities. What a great opportunity. You gave us a nice, pretty much list of African scholars that we could engage with. And the conversation is going on in the chat room. It's great. And I see that people are appreciating that. Thank you so much for the work that you do, to all of our presenters as well. And now we have a question from Uti. Uti, it's your turn.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I wasn't allowed to unmute myself briefly. Thank you for a fantastic, fantastic session. I have really learned a lot. So quickly to my question. Dr. Mabel spoke about, you know, this need for rooting African feminisms in indigenous signifiers of experience. And then Dr. Naomi spoke about this question of embodiment, how embodiment is becoming center stage in the discourse of feminism. And I really like your metaphor about different trees, you know, connecting together within the same kind of canopy. I was wondering, would the panelists think that there is need to further dig to the roots of African feminism on questions of embodiment? For example, Professor Mabel spoke about female insurgency, and I know that one of the very important tools of female resistance was the use of the body by women protesters. to sometimes by the time they go naked, they have a way of intervening into the conversations within the body politics in very, very strong ways. So I'm wondering, do you see in forms of cultural practice like wrestling, dance, these kinds of protests, the language for digging to the roots of African feminism that will root it rather than this cultural cross-continental discourse that tries to root embodiment in the French, cultural setting? I don't know if my question makes sense, but that's it. How do we redefine embodiments through signifiers originating from the African collective experience? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In Africa, we have huge resources where embodiment is concerned. Among the Efik of southeastern Nigeria, there is a dance referred to as the Ebre dance. It's a dance of sanction. It's a dance that is used to cut down to size the infractions by men and women. Furthermore, in traditional poetics, the woman's body is a site of power and significance. Some insurgent women have used nakedness to champion their cause. Madame Bowe in Liberia used the threat of nudity to forge peace amongst the warring parties. And that led to the downfall of the government of Charles Taylor in Liberia. In the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, some women of Ogborodo used the spiritual force of nakedness to shut down the oil producing facility of Chevron some years ago. Recall also that FGM, female genital mutilation, is part of the conscious efforts by patriarchy to cut down, limit, reduce the force that the woman's body has. And so for me, embodiment is significant, a great deal. Without, focusing on the power of the woman's body to nurture, to breastfeed, to bring to birth, and then create the future, create sustainability of the future, the human race will be nowhere. And I usually say that even the LGBT movement that prides itself on liberation would eventually lead to the reduction of the human species without accommodation made for the natural mode of conception, natural mode of male-female binaries in reproduction. And so insurgency relies a great deal on the woman's body when she decides to use it, when there's that political will and force to use her body to advance political causes. Thank you.
Oh.
I think I'm done.
All right, now I can unmute. I've been struggling to unmute for a while. Thank you, Professor Mabel. That's my auntie right there. So much. I'm really happy to be here with you. Yes, my response is very similar to yours, and I think there's considerable research that has been done in that field. At the top of my head, I can think of Neil Doughty's female husbands. But let me talk about the Cameroon case because I'm from Cameroon. And so we have two very important examples, like examples Mabel has given from Nigeria. We have two very significant cases, historical cases of women's embodiment, right, in protest movements. And the first one is the Anno of Com, which was a very powerful political movement that in fact changed the face of politics in the 1950s, because the Anno women marched to Bamenda, which is the capital city of the Northwest region where I'm originally from, to protest against colonial impositions of new agricultural laws on them. And what they did, like in the Nigerian case, once they got to the colonial headquarters, what they would do is they would undress. In fact, they undressed from the village and marched semi-nude with ritual.
Oh, wow.
Rituals have been performed, and they went there. The men would run away. And they were able to make a very strong political statement, and things were able to change for them during that time. The second example is the Takembe of Bamenda as well in 1990, when elections were rigged and the opposition did not get its rightful place. The Takembe women also did the same thing, and they used the body to protest against injustice in political elections. And so in the Cameroonian history, it's a very powerful force. The only problem I usually have with this when people write about it is the way in which it is written about. Is the kind of terms that are used about it. So when white women pose for the cameras or for canvas and paintings, they are called nude women. When our African women use their bodies to protest, which is a feminist act, then they are called. I have a problem with that, naked women. Are you kidding me? So I've actually written about that, and I've challenged some of the ways in which those terms are conceptualized. In fact, some scholars have argued that no, the Andu women were just used by men to achieve their own ends. Absolutely not. And there's a lot of scholarship on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Martins, do you have any potential example of how the Black women in the United States perhaps use their bodies to protest violence? Maybe contextual. I'm thinking of ways we can contextualize this question, specifically as relates to the United States.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I know that women have definitely always used their bodies in specific ways. And this whole conversation about the politics of the body have been very important in Black feminist conversations, because when Black women were brought here to the US, they did not have, that control over their bodies. Their bodies were used in a sense against them in so many, different ways, whether it was in transport, on the slave ships, or whether it was on the plantations, or even after slavery, so the sight of the Black woman's body and her fights, has been kind of a site for her fight to struggle for her own, right to control her body and her sexuality and, everything as well. So one thing that I noticed about Black women is that they will put themselves on the front lines. So when we talk about bodies and we talk about how women use their bodies, I know that Black women have consistently put their bodies on the front line. From when we looked at, I gave that example of Harriet Tubman. She put her body on the front line, and she was in danger all the time when she went back and was trying to get people and free men, women, and children from those plantations and bring them out. And then we have women who were, just like I mentioned, who were writing about lynching and writing about what was going on in the South, put their bodies on the line, because when you do that, the racists and white supremacists will come for you, especially in that early time period. So these women were, knowingly putting their bodies on the line for Black liberation, for Black men, women, and children's liberation. We saw the same thing during the Black Lives Matter movement. Black women formed a line between protesters and the police. Black women put their bodies between protesters and the police. So, you know, Black women have always been a part of this, they've always used their bodies anyways, you know, as a very radical space to proclaim their own autonomy and to protect the autonomy of their communities. One example that I can think of as well is during the civil rights movement, a lot of people don't really, you know, give, you know, this credit to Black women, but Black women actually really propelled and started the civil rights movement with their anti-rape campaign, which was again for their own right to use their body and their sexuality in the way that they wanted to. So women were the ones, you know, who said that human rights is a civil right. You know, so they formed that language of human rights as a civil right. You know, the right not to be, the human right to their own body and not to be raped is also a civil right. And so out of that rape campaign, we get some of the language for the civil rights movement that human rights is civil rights. And, you know, one of our favorite, you know, liberation activists, Rosa Parks, she was actually a legal counsel for, you know, that women's anti-rape campaign in the South. And so, you know, Black women's bodies have always been particular sites of interest. I know that there was this law or this rule, I forget the name of it, but white men basically, whether a Black man or a Black woman was married or single, whether she wanted sexual advances or not, it was a known kind of rule that white men, even after enslavement, I mean, this is 50s and 40s and, you know, in the US, that women, white men could come into a Black woman's house and, you know, have any kind of sexual contact with her, you know, so they've always been struggling, you know, for the right to use their bodies in the way that they want to. And they definitely have also, even under, you know, slavery and periods after that, they've also made their own decisions about how they're going to use their bodies in the face of, you know, all of these other forces that were trying to control what they could do with their bodies.
Thank you, Dr. Martins. We have a question in the chat that asked about the transgender, whether transgender women, whether they are part of the feminist movement. Yes, that's the question. This is to any of our presenters, or to all of our presenters, pardon me.
Yeah, I would say that transgender women have always, you know, been a part. So yes, they've always been a part of feminist struggles, though there have obviously been, you know, there has to be a contextualized conversation, you know, between women and transgender women. However, they've always been a part of the struggle. And some women do point out that trans women, they don't know if trans women can feel the full weight of womanhood in some instances. But however, trans women have always been welcome, have always been a part of the feminist movement. And there's even obviously been a term developed, you know, women with an X instead of an E, to include you know, trans women, and to avoid the use of men, you know, in the word women. So yeah, they've always been a part.
And pardon me, so real quick, in what way? Is there an example that we can look to that says transgender women have always been part of the movement or the women's movement?
Yeah, so in this conversation, we have to note as well that it's only been in modern periods that trans women have really been recognized. And so there might not be, you know, a lot of awareness about how they have historically been a part of the movement because they haven't been recognized, you know, so much in historical periods. But yeah, today, I know that there are groups anytime, let me just say with the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, over this last, you know, year and a half, especially as the world has been dealing with COVID and as the US and other locations have been dealing with so many issues, intricate issues that underlie all of their societies. And obviously racism is an issue, a big issue in our society. And with the Black Lives Matter protests of this whole past year and a half, transgender women have definitely been, you know, vocal. They've definitely been speaking out. They've definitely been talking about, you know, intersectional oppressions and freedoms because of their own positionality. So they support intersectionality because they understand that, you know, race, gender, you know, class, all of these things affect the way that someone operates in society. And so they've also started to, you know, speak up and talk more about the treatment of, you know, trans women in the Black liberation movement, because some of them, you know, are treated, are marginalized, some of their stories, some of their perspectives, but then there's also been a lot of violence against trans women that they've been speaking up against. So that's also been occurrence in, you know, some of the Black Lives Matter conversations, perspectives, and protests that I've seen lately.
Thank you. Dr. Naomi?
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yeah. Yes, indeed. I was going to say that's a trick question because I remember that we had that conversation before. I feel like Dr. Martin, that a lot of what transgender women do in the feminist movement is subsumed under the category of the LGBTI. So we're not very sure exactly of their own specific contributions. I know, for example, in South Africa, there's usually this gay pride march that happens. I don't remember which month, but the entire LGBTQI community comes out. Somebody getting married to celebrate, so they do a march across the streets of Johannesburg. When I was still a student, we had that on the main campus. So that happens all the time. But specifically, I don't know about any research that really looks about transgender women's contribution to feminist activism in South Africa specifically. My colleague, for example, Grant Andrews, does a lot of work in that field. He works, but mostly on gay writing. So that's an interesting conversation I may want to have with him. What exactly is the contribution of transgender women to feminist work in contemporary times? You know, like every category of people, some people just go with the flow, you move with the crowd and you kind of get lost along the way. But I think it's important that we also do some research and find out exactly what their contribution has been. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Mabel?
I think a network. So you can move on to the next question or to the queries the chat.
So there, just to let you know, there are discussions on whether transgender women are part of the movement going on in the chat. And there's somebody, I think Bridget, some of these questions, because there's quite a few conversation going on here. Bridget, you have a question. I don't know whether Bridget is still here. Okay, does anyone else has a question that we want to raise? Okay, so I have a question as we wait for our colleagues. So I'm wondering, in terms of the common ground, so we all highlighted the specific context and the issues that are, that are being addressed. I'm wondering though, what role, because I did not hear much of this, what role colonialism played in how things are working in Africa or not working, And the same way here in the United States, as it relates to slavery and the role that slavery plays in dehumanizing Black women and Black men, you know, because as I look at even the history of gender issues in Africa, be it in Nigeria specifically and in the United States, there's colonialism contributes to this. For example, like we have a ladder of who gets what. Let me make a specific question that has to do with Nigeria, for example. During the colonial period, when colonialists were structuring and putting people in places of power, it was white men, white women, African men, and then African women. But I don't often hear this conversation amongst the feminists, those mainstream feminists. I don't hear this nuance. I wonder why that is the case. Maybe it's a broad question, but I'm just wondering, why is that the case? This is to any of our presenters, please.
If Dr. Martin allows, I'll go first, if you don't mind. Okay, Evwierhoma. Yeah, important question. And I don't think there's been silence on it at all. I think a lot of feminist work has addressed the very basic problem that African feminisms or Western feminisms ignored the colonial element. I can think of the work by Mohanty, who has the beautiful book on third world feminisms, addresses the problems there. Let me talk about Nigeria because you've mentioned that example. And Professor Mabel mentioned the Aba riots, the Aba Women's War, which is a misnomer. It's not the Aba Women's War, it's Nigerian Women's War. It wasn't just about women. In fact, the conflict did not start in Aba. But one of the critical causes of that war is the fact that the colonial agents decided to take men away from helping the women in the farm to go work, to go build their railway lines. And the women, because the Igbo system was built on a very profound structure of division of labor, the women found that to be a slap in the face. So we have this oppressive system, and at the same time, you're taking the men away to go build your roads. And what happens to the fields? Because the men have to clear the fields, and then we can do the planting. So there was that division of labor, and the women thought this was too much. And it happened especially because it came at a time when the women were already feeling the pressure of the economic depression of 1929, right? And because these are market women, they sell, their life depended on their economic productivity. And so that was one of the fundamental causes of the Nigerian Women's War. And so the colonial element has always been very important. Similar things with the Women's March in South Africa. And if we talk about feminism without talking about the impact of colonialism on the ways in which gender and gender relations in particular have been restructured and structured differently in ways that then pit men against women, then we're not addressing African feminisms to the fullest extent. Because African feminisms always emphasize the fact that the colonial element played a critical role in determining the ways in which women and men relate to each other, and the ways in which patriarchy was then restructured to the disadvantage of women. So that's a fundamental aspect of African feminisms. And I think there's plenty of work on that.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Martins, because I don't see Dr. Mabel, so that's why I'm not calling on her.
Yeah, I would say that in addressing this idea, my thought is about the organizing principle. So there's an organizing principle in any society that affects, which is something that affects the way that people operate and think in that society. And those organizing principles, one of them here that specifically affects Black women, is this white supremacist racist capitalism. And that sincerely has shaped the way that Black women operate and respond to things in society. Because white supremacist racist capitalism, is spurred enslavement, and it spurred the racial hierarchy that we have here. It spurs so many things that affect and determine the likelihood of Black women reaching their full potential in society. And so when we look at this organizing principle, it has also shaped the way that Black men and Black women, relate to one another. So we have to, we definitely have to talk about, if we're going to have a broader, conversation about Black gender relations, about, Black women and their liberation, we definitely have to recognize white supremacist capitalism and the structures that it has employed, from, slavery to, lynching, to the Black codes, economic disenfranchisement, gender, very strict and rigid gender ideals, where women are always a category of what a man is not. So a woman is, not strong. A woman does not have a penis. A woman is not suitable for public life. All of these kinds of ways that white men, made the category of woman this anti-category to man. So a woman is not as strong as, is not as capable as, so on and so forth, as a man. So with that type of gender ideal, and working from that type of gender ideal that Evwierhoma talks about in, her book as well, The Invention of Women, and a lot of, her different writings, she talks about how, Western gender ideals are tied to the body. There's this biological determinism where, everything that a woman is tied to her body. And usually, you can't extricate things when they're tied to the body. Just like here, race is tied to the body. I cannot extricate race from my body because it's tied to the way that I look. So if your oppression as a woman is tied to the way that you look, then it's hard to ever transcend that and get out of it. So this white supremacist capitalism has made and managed and organized society in such a way that it can always put itself and put whiteness and white supremacy on top. So we definitely have to deal with that conversation if we want to talk about, in meaningful ways, the way that context matters and the way that, these kinds of actions matter when we're, looking at the women reaching their full potential, or gender relations between men and women. So I think that one example of how racist supremacist capitalism, and there's many examples of how it has affected the lives of Black women, but when we talk about the erasure of Black women in Black liberation movements, I already talked a little bit, in my presentation about some of the troubles that Black women were having, in these Black liberation movements with, the language of it really being about the liberation of Black men, and assuming that if Black men are free, then Black women are free. But that's not, the case. You need to really address, which is why Black feminism tries to address a broader spectrum of isms and oppressions, because you can't just address one group and assume that the other group is going to be free. So when we think about it that way, there's an erasure that has happened with Black women and their, issues in Black liberation movements. And that's why they had to start the Say Her Name movement, with even within Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter was started by Black women. So, we have to look at racist, white supremacist capitalism and the way that it has affected Black women's liberation and Black gender relations to even understand why today there's still an erasure of Black women in Black liberation movements that they started. So yeah, it is an important conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Martin. Does anyone else have a question?
I just see some questions in the chat.
Could I ask
could they voice them?
Okay.
Because there's quite a few of them.
Okay, Dr.
They
Shabazz.
could voice them out.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Dr. Mabel, in your slides, you included African-American feminists within the Western category. And I wanted to suggest a more Pan-African framing where African-American women are part of the African discussion and not the Western discussion. You know, after all, African-Americans were not even citizens until the 1960s. And so I think of us more as victims of Americanism and Westernism than we are Western. What say you?
So for me, obviously, you know, as I said, with the whole idea of white supremacist capitalism, we definitely have been, you know, victimized and been victims of that enterprise. So that's, you know, I think that goes definitely without stating. But with my presentation, I wanted to focus on, you know, the development of Black feminism and the conversations around Black feminism, not to separate it from African feminism, but, you know, just to concentrate on some of the principles, the history, you know, some of the currents that come out of that specific framework and context. But for me, you know, obviously, as a scholar who is Pan-African and forming my own Pan-African theories and my own Pan-African approach, you know, to African studies, as a Black studies Africanist who does not compartmentalize Africa, but brings Africa and the diaspora into a conversation with one another to bring about, you know, a broader and a more deep understanding and connectivity in the Black world. I definitely, you know, think that there are connections, you know, between African feminism and Western feminism. So I would say that, you know, Black feminism has characteristics of African cultural principles that are that are respect, communalism, hospitality, honor of life. Black feminism has also has an integrated approach to healing, you know, where they develop consciousness, they center developing consciousness, providing emotional support and providing mindful, you know, methods of maintaining peace in these really disruptive anti-Black, you know, situations that we find ourselves in the West or in the US. And so in my studies, I've always seen that, you know, African cultures do express this integrated approach. And I also, you know, see that in, you know, Black feminism. So there's definitely a, you know, cultural and a continuity of principles, a continuity of culture between African and, you know, Black feminism, but there are obvious differences as well. So that's what I would say to address that.
Yeah, Professor Mabel, are you here? Yeah, I think she's still having internet issues. So Dr. Naomi, perhaps you can address that question.
I was going to say one thing. African feminisms actualize indigenous cultures in mind, but they have global exigencies. So there's always that global outlook, and that's very important. That's basically what I'm saying in response to that. So a Pan-African approach by all means. I just need to make a request because I need to leave. Yoknyam, you know my story.
Yes.
After 8 o'clock, my nanny needs to go. So if you'll excuse me, I don't know if you want Anna or you can excuse me. But
yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. We're a little over time, so now we're just gonna keep going for just maybe one more we're gonna, you know, and then we'll end it. But thank you so much for being here, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Martin.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Bye.
Bye. So I think we'll just address just maybe one more question, and we need to end because of, you know, we've been here for some time. I know we're enjoying this, but pardon me?
Uti's hand is up.
Uti's hand is up. Okay.
Uti.
I was going to make a point, but then it skipped my mind. But okay, Uti, you may go, please.
Yes, so this is a question I really wish all the panelists were here, but my question is this. It appears, and this is my estimation, that feminist studies, feminist scholarship always finds itself at the front line of innovative discourse, at the cutting edge. In fact, as an undergrad studying in Nigeria, one of the very few theories, or some of the very few theories that I knew were feminist theories. They were the ones who were theorizing womanism, nego-feminism, all kinds of things. So I was wondering, Dr. Martin, could you speak to what is it about feminist studies that makes it this hotbed of ideas and discourses and conversations that often is now diffusing into other fields? And what do you think Africanist scholars, African studies in general can learn from feminism as a field of discourse? Because some persons here might say, I'm not in feminist studies, but what is it that feminism can do as a template of scholarship that it affords to these other fields? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, feminism is, being recognized, or not even just feminism, but issues dealing with women and gender and so on and so forth are being recognized in all of these other fields, because women are half of the world. And we can't, ignore their experiences and the things that they need. We can't ignore the fact that there have been oppressions that have been waged upon them and that have affected the way that they operate in society. And so people have been recognizing this, and they've been recognizing that it is not only in one area, it's not only in two areas, it's in, a lot of different areas and fields. It's transcendent in all areas, actually. So if there are men and women operating in any area, we need to understand how the ideas and the structures in society affect the way that they can operate in that area. So that's why different, disciplines and all of these other fields are taking up this, notice that, oh, we need to actually look into this, a little bit more. And then I think you also asked about, like these different elements, like why are there these different elements of feminist thought and theories, coming out. And so for me, I think that when I think about context, I think about culture. And when I think about culture, to me, whatever your thoughts are, whatever you ruminate on, those become habits, and then habits become culture, and then culture shapes everything. Culture is ubiquitous, and so when we think in that frame, culture is going to take on certain elements in different contexts, because we're all socialized to think in certain ways. Therefore, our habits will be shaped in certain ways. Therefore, our culture, will be expressed in certain ways in different contexts. So as we express culture in all of these contexts, and we also recognize that there needs to be an addressing of women's issues, of gender issues, so on and so forth, those different iterations of culture that are held within the way that we talk about and address issues of women, gender, so on, sexuality, so on and so forth, they're going to be different because the context is different. So we need different theories. We need Black feminism. We need African feminism. We need, global feminisms as well. So we need the macro, the larger, and we need the micro, the smaller and more contextualized.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Anyone has a question?
Yeah, my question is in regards to what we raised in the chat concerning this oppression, which has been a central issue in feminism. And I just want to ask, there's been so much emphasis laid on men's oppression of women and the African society and culture. What about women's oppression of women? And how does feminism also address the women's oppression on women and women's oppression on men? And I don't know whether that's also peculiar to our American situation, but we know that from literature, we have that dominant in most of African literary works written by feminists pointing to this oppression. I don't know if there's any comment on that. Any response from our speakers. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that when we get to some of those currents that I was talking about, like with womanism and Africana womanism, I think that they do create a space where we can have more, contextualized and complex conversations about what it means to be woman, what and how culture affects womanhood, and therefore how culture and how womanhood, how our ideas and how we envision ourselves affect the way that we relate to ourselves. Because I know a part of womanism, a big part of womanism, and then also Africana womanism is the relationship. So where feminism, even Black feminism, really was so concerned because of the moment and the context that it grew out of, it was so concerned with, women, gender, sexism. Then when we get to a point where, okay, now we have this agenda, now we're moving forward with, our liberation struggle for women, now we can start to kind of envision how we can deal with more of the complexities. The Combahee, River Collective wrote about this in their statement, that as they went on, they started to notice that, oh, wow, there's some complexities here that's kind of making it difficult for us to wage our agenda. And so we need to address them. So, I think that a part of addressing the relationship to, of women to women and how they treat women, how they interact with women, can, come up more with the centering of relationships that womanism does. So I think that, that we have, some tools that we can use to address the way that women relate to one another. And I think that even with other waves of feminism, like with successive waves of white feminism, they've also, come, to that point where they're like, okay, we need to address what's going on and how women are, treating other women, how white women are treating other women of color, or, how white women are co-opting, at times the stories of other women to say, just to wage their own, movement and say, oh, well, look at how, women in other countries are being treated. This is why we need feminism. So we're going to keep fighting for it. But do you really support these women? So I think there's successive waves of feminism, and then also womanism and how it centers relationship and, healthy communities is a way that we could, approach that relationship of women to women and how some women treat women.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Martin. And you see, Augustine's question got me thinking, I mean, as it relates to, there's this, I see it as a serious problem all over the continent. It's a broad statement I'm making, but it has to do with house girls, the way they are often maltreated. And the irony of, or maybe the term is not irony, but when we speak of feminism, right? These are women that are abusing other women or potential women because they're little girls, they go through extreme violence. I mean, I've seen this with people who have house girls. So, but it's I was just saying that Augustine's question got me thinking about that and how we sometimes, do not highlight this, or even here in the United States, because I pay attention to local issues, of course, and other Black girls, young African American girls, often they're just left on their own device, do your own thing. Mind you, we have tons of feminists. I'm wondering, where are they and how can they perhaps nurture these young girls? And I know that you're doing that because you're reaching to African girls and here in the United States. And also Dr. Mabel did mention, it's from her work, she lent hand to the needy girls. But it's something that I often wonder when it comes to feminism and how feminism can be also not only maybe critiquing men's approach to order, but also how women could work together to build each other. I think we've been here for a long time. but we're going to have to conclude, but let me just read real quick some of the questions that we're comments. So because some of our viewer, our chat room is quite active. And I just want to let you know that we're thinking there's what can African women learn from their Western counterparts? And then there's also, great talks from all the panelists. Thank you. There's somebody that say, Asante Sana for such a great presentation, awesome program. So we're really learning from all of you. And even though our two panelists are not here, Dr. Martins, we really appreciate you being here. We're learning a lot. You got me thinking. And I'm sure my colleagues here too are thinking about ways we can work together. It's not just men over there and women over there, as Africans, as people of African descent, and we're working towards building communities and working together so that we can uplift ourselves from whatever level of oppression that we're experiencing. Brother Augustine, do you have 2 minutes to conclude this program? Thank you, by the way, Brother Shabazz, for doing the intro to our guest. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Yokiam. And there is nothing to say again than to talk about the next webinar, which is coming up in September. So we are having, I think, am I sharing that, right?
Yes, you're sharing.
Oh,
yes.
Okay. So we're going to have this title, African-China Relation, Business or Colonialism. And then we have Dr. Adebola Ola and Dr. Tara Mock. And we hope that the attendees who have experiences can prepare towards it. And if you have questions and comments that you want the speakers to address ahead, you can send it across. But I want to also use this opportunity to thank Dr. Martins, Professor Mabel, and Dr. Naomi, and the ARN team, and everyone for making this a success. We have been preparing for this for months, and we're so happy. And I must confess that it's really been a great day, because it's like we should have another feminist edition or feminist session, because the webinar and the environment and everywhere just look so cool and so wonderful that we always hope that the conversation continues and more publications. So thank you very much. And on this note, if there's no comments from the board members like Dr. Jim Paris and others, I think on behalf of ARN team, the directors, the associates, the consultants, the advisory board, we want to say thank you to everyone for coming, and have a great day. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.